he is able to join in this early morning. Thank you, Professor Atfield, and I would like to congratulate UNA Cardiff for the 75th anniversary of the UN, and thank you for having me on this occasion. When I was working on my PhD thesis at the London School of Economics, President Clinton hit Al-Shifa factory in Khartoum with a guided missile. And my supervisor, Fred Halliday, met me, and he said, Clinton gave you a chapter. And he was true. Now President Trump is attempting, in fact, to manipulate or to utilize the issue of normalization between Sudan and Israel as one of his foreign policy campaign to win votes over Joe Biden, is also overshadowing our meeting today. And also 2 days ago, President Carter issued an important decree called Rescission of Determination, which is a certification to the Congress that Sudan has satisfied the measures or the standards the Congress set in the law issued in the 1990s, 1993, exactly, about adding Sudan to the list of countries supporting terrorism. So hopefully Sudan will be lifted from this list, according to this decree, but the Congress needs about 45 days to issue a new law.
Okay, cool.
Or to
but we're not I'm not muted on this recording,
which puts Sudan on this list. So it's this is in fact now
I'll call you after the
news this is making in fact main sheets in the United States, in Sudan, and elsewhere. And I attended the discussion, in fact, between a Sudanese colleague with an American colleague. He's a Democrat, and he was saying to my colleague in Sudan, he is one of people considered as decision makers now, in fact. He said to him, if Sudan waits for 2 months, Biden might give Sudan a better deal. And my friend in Sudan responded by saying, one bird in hand is better than two in the bush. And in fact, this is one of the arguments going on here in Khartoum now. Many people, in fact, they are just looking forward to get out of the economic crisis, to get some stability in the country. So this is very much dominating the thinking of people here now. So this kind of pragmatic thinking, in fact, is prevailing in Khartoum, I may say. Although this will affect Sudan, of course, and will have many implications domestically and regionally as well, because Sudan is known, or Khartoum is known as the capital of the three no's. When it hosted the Arab Summit in 1967 after the defeat of Nasser by Israel. And the summit came to three no's. On the top of that, no normalization with Israel. Even no peace with Israel was one of the three no's. And Israel, in fact, identified two main objectives from this normalization with Sudan. One of them, or on top of them, in fact, is the airspace, because Israel used to pay a lot of money to avoid flying over the Sudan airspace, going to Latin America, to other countries in Africa. So this is one of the very important benefits for Israel from this deal. And when Netanyahu met with General Burhan in Uganda earlier this year, that was the deal struck, in fact, by the two leaders. And in fact, when Pompeo flight came from Tel Aviv to Khartoum directly, that was very symbolic of what the relation will be in the near future. It was the first flight, of course, in the past probably 40 or 60, 50 years. So it's the other interest identified by Israel is agriculture, and Khartoum will receive early next week an envoy, or in fact group of experts in agriculture to come and discuss with the people in Khartoum of joint projects in agriculture. So these are the two objectives for, or main interests, in fact, for Israel, in addition to the political gain, of course, and during the time of election in the US. And so it's, this is atmosphere, in fact, now in Khartoum. It just overshadowed, and I think when Professor Robin arranged for this meeting, it was in July, in fact, and it was probably his gut feeling that such developments will happen in between. My speech is on Sudan prospects. We might come to this later, definitely in the discussion. But my speech is talk about Sudan problems and prospects. And the title, in fact, is a reflection of an old social science wisdom that human being is capable of doing good things. At the same time, is capable of doing bad and destructive and terrible things as well. And this can also reflect on the reality in Sudan, that Sudan has the longest war in Africa, but it has the longest river in the world, competing with the Mississippi, and probably one of the cleanest water in the world. Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world, but at the same time, it has fertile lands the size of Western Europe. Only, or Darfur alone is the size of France, to give you a clear or closer picture. So Sudan is, or people in Sudan were doing good things, were doing also terrible things. In fact, Sudan witnessed all sorts of war manifestation, and insurgency, secession, rebellion, and this has resulted in war crimes and crimes against humanity, genocide. So Sudan witnessed all that. But one of the good things it did, and this is my first point, is the revolution of December 2018, which ended by April the 11th. And in fact, Sudan witnessed two revolutions before, in October 64 and in April 85. But this revolution is unique in that it is led by youth. It continued for a long time. That is why I call it the creeping revolution, or hopefully the title of my next book, in Sudan. And in fact, the protests and massive protests continued for about 5 months, and it encountered violent dispersal for the sit-in outside the military headquarters in Khartoum, and many of these youth were killed, injured, and thrown in the river. There was rape, burning people alive, all that kind of things happened during this time, although the youth call it a peaceful revolution, and they insisted to raise this slogan throughout the revolution. But the crackdown against the protest was sometimes very fierce, and there were a lot of or a loss of lives, in fact. And the worst one happened, of course, on the 30th or the 3rd of June, in fact, on the eve of Eid, and where about 100 of the youth were killed that night. And it was the saddest day, in fact, in the history of, probably one of the saddest days in history of modern Sudan. But resistance continued, and this is probably what Fred Halliday calls dynamics of coercion and resistance. This kind of resistance continued until the military announced the removal of President Omar al-Bashir from power and installed General Burhan, who is the president of the present Sovereign Council. And from May until August, Sudan remained without a government, with the risk of having terrorist attacks and news about Daesh and Boko Haram crossing the northern and western borders of Sudan, and all sorts of instability Sudan experienced during that period. And there was this kind of balance between the civilian and military, and both claim or have claims to change, because the military, they think they did the change and they installed a new president and removed President Bashir. But of course, people who did the real change, because the protest continued for 5 months with a lot of sacrifices, as we have seen. So it's this kind of discrepancy between the civilians and military continued, and is still in fact continuing, and because there is also the element of regional influence and some kind of alliance between military leaders and some governments in the Gulf and Egypt. And, but in fact, the will of the people of Sudan this time imposed a new civilian government in September last year. And this government, led by Prime Minister Hamdouk, we saw him in the talk in the video just now, is now about 1 year or more in power. In fact, the economic situation is deteriorating very fast. This is one of the important facts. And people enjoyed freedom, in fact, but at the same time, they didn't enjoy food, or because the prices of food are rising very, very fast, and inflation rate is also topping unprecedented levels. So it's and it is getting every day worse. To give you a close also look at this, for example, the gallon of fuel was 30 pounds before the revolution, or at least before the new government came. From 30 pounds, now we are talking about 50 pounds, 500 pounds. From 30 to 500. The prices of bread, when the price of bread reached 3 pounds for a piece of bread in the city of Atbara, that was the start of the revolution. Now, from 3 pounds to 10 pounds, and it will go further. So, this is what I also call in my analysis is that freedom and democracy did not mean prosperity in Sudan. And people are really suffering, but still people are bearing with this new experience of democracy, and they are seems they are still willing to sacrifice to continue, and they have hope, in fact, to overcome these difficulties, as the Prime Minister always said. Democracy, in fact, in Sudan, it had 4 chances in power in history of modern Sudan. From independence up to now, we had 4 democratic governments, and we had 4 military governments. And this is unique. If you look around in the region, you may find one military regime is staying since the independence until now, or just one attempt to bring democracy. It failed here or there. But in fact, in Sudan, this reflects that the people of Sudan have tendency to return to democracy. This is one of the important things. My second point, let me move. My second point is about the transitional justice, because there were hundreds of people killed during the revolution, and their families, and also their colleagues, and everybody around them are asking for justice. And in fact, there was optimism. Justice will be brought very quickly. The Prime Minister or the new cabinet established a new committee for the investigations into the crimes committed in the sitting and the killing of protesters, and with one of the prominent lawyers on top of this committee. And this committee promised, in fact, in 3 months to finish its work. Now it's almost 1 year, and no final report was issued by the committee. And the last thing I heard from the head of this investigation committee, Nabil Adib, saying that it is not an easy business, and it seems it will take more time. In fact, many committees established by the government to investigate cases of crimes like this, or corruption, or are still continuing without issuing any final report. The only case which came to an end is the first charges against Omar al-Bashir of corruption, of having 25 million at his office in the palace, dollars. And that was finalized, and he was charged with corruption and jailed for 2 years, waiting for other also issues. In fact, this is because transitional justice in Sudan is threefold. This is the first one. The second one is the crimes of the military coup of 1989, when Omar al-Bashir came to power, and the corruption crimes also subsequent to this performance of this government, and the crimes against humanity also in Darfur. And this is, of course, is being investigated by the ICC, and the about 5 of the leaders of the government were indicted by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in The Hague. 10 days ago, Fatou Bassunde, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, visited Khartoum, and her last report to the Security Council is that she is ready to negotiate with the government of Sudan to bring justice, to try the people responsible for genocide in Darfur, and she is open, as she said, for either trying these suspects in courtroom in The Hague or in Khartoum by judges from The Hague and Khartoum. And in fact, this is the opinion of the Prime Minister. He wants a joint trial to be held in Khartoum with judges from The Hague and Khartoum. Because Omar al-Bashir is facing also charges under the law, Sudan law, and he should be tried for that in Khartoum as well. And it seems this is the direction of the ICC. There was usually an ecstasy view of peace justice, usually when kind of change like this happen. But in Sudan, it doesn't play because of the type of the change, the revolutionary one, because usually in other cases, we have seen that in Bosnia, in different places, the government and the victims of war come to, even in South Africa, we have seen also some kind of this. But in Sudan, this is not in play, as I said, because the rebels themselves who led the war in Darfur and in the 2 areas of South Kordofan and Blue Nile are part of the change. So they are part of the coalition or ruling coalition, which is called FFC, the Forces for Freedom and Change. So they are part of this change itself. So they don't have a deal to strike with to make a balance between peace and justice. And of course, the former government who is responsible for this. So this is just a hint on that. My third point is about economic sanctions, or about sanctions, in fact, generally against Sudan, financial and other sanctions imposed on Sudan. And this, in fact, Sudan is also unique because we have seen a kind of sanctions versus revolution, because sanctions generally is imposed to bring change. The change happened in Sudan. Why should sanctions continue? This is the simple logic, simple question people asking. And Prime Minister Hamdouk gave an interview to the Financial Times about 10 days ago, saying that Bin Laden left Sudan 20 years ago, and the regime which hosted Bin Laden is removed by a popular revolution. Why should we have sanctions continuing still? Also raised the question of whether sanctions target the government, the people, or the country. Of course, there was the issue in international law of state responsibility, but the government, in fact, the new government of Hamdouk, when came to power, expected that Sudan will be removed from the list of terror by the United States will also be or sanctions, financial sanctions against Sudan will be revoked or also immediately. And this, in fact, did not happen and continued for 1 year and a half, in fact, since the revolution succeeded in removing the old regime. And we just have seen this week that President Trump is certifying to the Congress, as we said, to remove Sudan just this week. There were two issues I noticed, because this is my area of interest. I noticed that there was no attempt to suspend sanctions. And the other issue also I noticed there was no ultimatum in the case of sanctions against Sudan. And so the issue of suspension was around many cases before, but Hamdouk did not ask for suspension. He asked for the removal of Sudan from the list directly, probably because he was very optimistic that Sudan now opened to the international community, and the international community will respond immediately by removing these sanctions. But he waited more than 1 year for that. And also there was no ultimatum issued when these sanctions were also imposed. We have seen in the case of Hosni Mubarak in 1995, Sudan was given 90 days by the Security Council to hand over the suspects and to accept the measures imposed by the Security Council. And after 90 days, in fact, this was also unique that Sudan didn't give up the suspects, and at the same time, the issue was not rethought in the, if I may say, in the Security Council, or revisited by the Security Council, and it was just died away like that. So, but there was an ultimatum of 90 days, and these were absent in the case of Sudan for people who are interested in the area of sanctions. My next point is about the peace agreement or the peace process in Sudan. And also this is, I think, where Professor Atfield also captured the right moment, because just last or on the 3rd of October specifically, 5 rebel movements signed a final peace deal with the transitional government. And this deal, in fact, is built on share of power and share of wealth and security arrangements and compensations. To start with the issue of compensations, it raised, in fact, some difficulties in north of Sudan and in east of Sudan, where people argued against giving compensation just to specific areas and giving share of power and share of wealth for them, because the compensation will continue for 10 years. The government will continue to pay these areas who are expected to be governed also by leaders from these armed movements. And we have seen in eastern Sudan that people blocked even or totally closed the port of Sudan. The only port of Sudan is closed for a few days, and they are still protesting. There was also killing of about 20 people in Port Sudan and Kassala, and in northern Sudan, but also we have seen some protests against the agreement on this issue. But anyway, the implementation of the agreement is going on. Power will be shared. The armed movements will have seats in the Sovereign Council and in the executive, in the cabinet, and they will have also a large number of seats in the Legislative Council, which is not established yet. There is a question also of whether the coming of the armed movements and joining the government will enhance the performance of the government, because there is general unsatisfaction about the performance of the government, and some of these movements are talking about their qualified members who will join the government and support the government and help in improving their performance. So my last point probably is the international community and Sudan. And I titled this Broken Promises. We have heard this rhetoric in the video at the start of this meeting. And in fact, the director of the central bank, Sudan Central Bank, was talking just a few days to one of the newspapers here, and he was saying there is very little of the pledges made by European countries and other countries and financial institutions reach the bank. And it's also, we have seen, in fact, since this government started, we have seen visits by Prime Minister of Sweden, France, Germany, and USA as well. But the people here feel that little came out of these visits, and the Prime Minister of Sweden pledged $15 million, France 50 million, Germany 15 million. So it's just people see as peanuts and not, all in all, cannot build or make one small project. In fact. So people here generally are not satisfied, especially because the Prime Minister Hamdouk, when he came to power, he visited the United States twice in the first month in office, and his Minister of Finance also visited the United States also twice or 3 times, and they were hopeful that the international community will lend a hand to this new democratic government and help the process of democratic transition in Sudan. In fact, there is a general disappointment about what the contributions, the actual or real contribution of the international community. There is a point of critique of Western analysis, and in fact this goes back to I remember I talked to Lehman. He was U.S. envoy to Sudan, one of the earliest, probably the first one or the second, and he's a specialist in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa. We met at the United States Institute for Peace, USIP, a few years ago before he passed away. And we were discussing about Sudan, and I said to him, there are new dynamics. That was in 2014, I remember. And there are new dynamics in Sudan. The old parties, political parties, are no longer dominating the scene in Sudan. there is a new generation rising in Sudan, and this should be considered in any analysis. Also, in fact, there are many accounts which may not be available or possible for somebody who is visiting Sudan from time to time. And I noticed that, in fact, in some of the analysis of prominent professors and leading experts, in fact, in the field, like, for example, the consideration of, in fact, expect Professor Zuns to be with us. He sent me an article to read, and I said, when you say that despite the Sudan is a poor country and the means of communication are very primitive, still the young people were able to manipulate the communication apps to make this revolution. And I said, unfortunately, or fortunately for Sudan, in fact, that the communication system in Sudan is very developed. The use of internet is by children in their 2 and 3 years old. Children are using these apps, and it was used very effectively by youth during the revolution. They were able to call for a 10 million protests in just one day. And we haven't seen any power like this for any old political party in Sudan. So to come back to the first point. Also, there are various delicate, for example, we have in Sudan the Sudan Armed Forces. This is Armed Force of Sudan, and we have RSP, or the Rebel Support Forces, RSF, which was a militia and developed into a kind of organized military force, but still it has a, but you can't compare between the two, despite this was well armed and everything. But the Sudan Armed Forces has the air forces, for example, RSF or the Rebel Support Forces, the militia one. They don't have air forces. They don't have fighting jets. They don't have heavy artillery. They don't have tanks. They just have this kind of cars. We call it in Sudan, Tacha is a kind of land cruiser, heavy-duty land cruiser, armed ones. They use it. They have big number of that. They have, and we'll come that to the last point. But these kind of differences are very hard to notice, for, as I said, for an observer from outside, and that is why combined research between people from the field and well-established analysts like our professors is very important. My last point is about dysfunctional politics in Sudan. In fact, there is a kind of proliferation of political parties in Sudan. We have fragmentation of armed forces, armed movements in wide numbers. And I will give just an example. After the last revolution in '85, we had 3 main political parties and other small parties, probably about 5 or 6 in total, who ran for the election. That was in 1985. After this revolution, now each one of the 6 parties is divided into about 5, 10 parties like that. The biggest party probably Ummah and the Unionist. Ummah party was one party in the election in 1985 or 1986. Now we have about 10 Ummah parties. We have about 11 Unionist political parties. The Islamists were 2 parties at that time. Now we have about 6 Islamist political parties. The communists also divided into different parties. The Ba'ath is the same. So this kind of political parties proliferation, I call it a proliferation because it's when it's used in nuclear, it's late stage to be tackled, to be reigned, and when you use it in medicine also, is the late stage also. And this is why people started to lose hope about the political functioning in Sudan. And also for the armed movements, in 1985, we had only one armed movement led by John Garang in South Sudan. Now, the armed movements who signed the agreement are 5. There are other 2 main armed movements didn't join the agreement. And when the five movements signed, there was also fragmentation happened within this because some of them were not happy with the deal. So they established another movement. So this kind of what I said, fragmentation, proliferation, in fact, is making the situation very difficult and making people hope, in fact, in these political and armed movements to come to kind of deal and agreement to make stability and prosperity in Sudan is something not tangible, in fact, at least at this time, for the people in Sudan. The possibility of having a military coup, in fact, is it has no big chances now in Sudan for one reason, because we have several dynamics working. It brought the situation, I call it a state of static or durable situation, that no single party or no single military force can lead the military coup, because now there is the militia there of RSF, there is Sudan forces, also there is the big power of the youth who are ready to move to the streets and to protest against any coup attempt. And they did that before, and they are ready to repeat that as well. So it's not a looming possibility to have a military coup in Sudan, and this is my own opinion. But if you ask me, what do you think the best scenario should be for Sudan? My own opinion, and you can discuss with me in the discussion session on this. I will say it is for the new generation to start the country afresh. And I finish with this note, and thank you very much for listening.